It is at this stage until you absolutely have to, and the reason for that, as I said, is we're trying to ensure that we capture any potential seeding that occurred during the time when those cases were transmitting through Greater Melbourne. Out of those 18,500 tests or so, all but 2 of the previously confirmed cases in Albury are overseas travellers, which is a good result in that there hasn't been any additional community transmission apart from the 2 Albury cases we talked about a few days ago, and I'll ask Dr Chant obviously to cover that in her report. And there is also a 3rd family member who's likely to have got that, but I'll ask Dr Chant to give that detailed report. So at this stage there's no evidence of any additional community transmission, but again we all have to be on high alert. If somebody asks me what our status of both sentiment and action should be today and the following few days and weeks, and I say weeks, is we should all be in a state of high alert. We should all be more conscious of the fact that there could be elements of community transmission, especially in those border communities that haven't been picked up, and that's why we need to be extremely careful no matter where we are, especially if anybody has had contact with anybody who's been in Greater Melbourne for the last few weeks. And of course, you know that if you're a returning New South Wales resident, you have to make sure that you self-isolate for that period of 14 days to be safe for yourself, your loved ones and the broader community. Can I also stress in relation to returning travellers, I was asked yesterday about what we're likely to impose. Can I state quite stridently that we will be charging overseas returning visitors before we charge New South Wales residents. So our focus is consideration of what we do with those ongoing return travellers from overseas, and New South Wales has done more than double what any other state has. We've welcomed back about between 30 and 35,000 Aussies going back to their home states. And obviously they've had considerable time to consider their options to this point in time. So the New South Wales Government is considering our position regarding that. And I won't be charging New South Wales residents ahead of charging those overseas returning travellers who've had plenty of time to get back to Australia. I'll now ask Dr Chant to give her update, and then Minister Dominello is going to recap on the great work Service New South Wales is doing, but also highlight that we appreciate during the course of this pandemic the cost of living pressures on our communities, and it's heartening to know that in the last 3 years alone $3 billion have been saved by our communities on cost of living measures, and Service New South Wales is continuing to increase information to people who have access to over 70 rebates, because we don't want anyone to feel unnecessary financial stress during this time. And we can, and obviously Service New South Wales is a great way in which to relieve some of that household pressure, and Minister Dominello will talk about that at greater length. But I also wanted to stress that what's occurred in Victoria is a wake-up call for all of us about how contagious the virus is, how it doesn't take very long for things to escalate quickly, and how it doesn't take very long for that rate of community transmission to increase. And so all of us have to be on high alert. That's the state we're on. And because of, as I said, we're monitoring the situation a number of times a day, and because of that high rate of continued testing and the very low rate of community transmission, the New South Wales monitoring especially the potential seeding that may have occurred in those border communities and also throughout other parts of New South Wales, and that remains our focus. So, Dr Chant.
So there's been 13 cases of COVID diagnosed in New South Wales in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night, bringing the total number of cases to 3,264. 11 of those cases are returned travellers in hotel quarantine. The 2 other additional cases were the probable cases that we identified in the media on the 3rd and 4th, and they were Albury residents. And whilst it's not included in our numbers today, I want to indicate that there's an additional family member that has tested positive, and that family member has been in isolation for a number of days when we first identified the cases in the initial index case. So just to indicate that the index case did have travel to Greater Melbourne, and we believe that that is the source of infection. I'm very pleased to see the response in Albury. There's been an extensive turnout for testing in the community, and I would continue to ask all the border communities to be vigilant and to ensure that they present for testing whenever they have the mildest symptoms. I would also like to clarify that whilst when the border closure came into effect, there were requirements to self-isolate with some exceptions for critical services. Those self-isolation guidelines need to be adhered to. That is critical. And again, I would urge you to get tested if you've got even the minimum of symptoms. Prior to that border closure order, there were public health orders in place. And in essence, anyone who had returned from the Greater Melbourne area needs to self-isolate for 14 days after departing the Greater Melbourne area. And I do call upon the community to heed this public health measure. It is essential that we stop the further seeding into New South Wales of cases from Victoria. And I know that it is challenging sometimes to self-isolate, but I call upon family members and community members to support people to self-isolate, and also urge anyone who has returned from Victoria, in particular hotspot areas, to come forward for testing with even the most minimal symptoms. This will help us to keep New South Wales residents safe.
COVID has had an enormous impact on our lives, on the economy, and on family budgets. And that's why it's now more important, more than ever before, for people to call Service New South Wales 137788 and make an appointment over the phone to see a cost of living officer. Cost of living has resulted in, as the Premier said, over $3 billion of savings for families in their budget, and that is important now more than ever before. And there's been a range of initiatives that we've released over the last 3 years to help families out, whether it's the cost of living officer itself, whether it's fuel check, whether it's energy switch, whether it's active kids, creative kids. There are over 70 initiatives that we have rolled out right across government to help families with their bottom line, particularly during tough times like now. But what we've done to make it better is, rather than going to every agency and trying to find the initiative that helps you, you go to one-stop shop called Service New South Wales. They've got a dedicated cost of living officer that will then do all that heavy lifting for you, that will take all the stress away for you, and then find savings for you and your family. The average saving so far is over $500, which is a lot of money, particularly during these difficult times. We've had almost 60,000 people go through a cost of living officer and get savings for them and their families. And just as importantly for me and the government is the experience. So far, the customer experience in relation to going through a cost of living officer is in the order of 97%. That is almost perfection. So it's not only good to get the money, it's easy to get the money for you and your family.
Premier, is there any more information about that Jetstar bundle?
So in terms, I can confirm that all members of the people who arrived, the passengers on that flight, were contacted and tested, except for 5 that are being tested today. So all of the follow-up action has occurred, and I'm pleased to say that the final 5 are being tested today.
And when you say tested, do you mean COVID tested or just temperature checked?
I believe that it's COVID testing, but I will get that confirmed.
Premier, are you rolling back any restrictions in New South Wales today?
Not at this stage, but I do want to stress again to everybody that we're on high alert, because what we need to do is to make sure there hadn't been any seeding prior to the rate of community transmission becoming apparent in Melbourne especially. So we just need to confirm in the next few weeks that that level of seeding hasn't occurred, and so far the signs are positive, but we won't know for sure for a couple of weeks. So we are monitoring the situation daily. What concerns me most is to make sure that if there has been any seeding, with residents coming across the borders and the border communities, that people with the milder symptoms do come forward and get tested. And certainly on our side of the border, I was heartened to know that in the last 2 days we've had more than 400 Albury residents come forward and get tested, which is fantastic. But anyone with the milder symptoms in those border communities, and I'm not too fussed which side of the border, I mean, happy to take anyone getting tested on our side of the border, but we're really keen to make sure that we flush through any of those potential seeding, any of the seeding that may have occurred. And of course, I'm also concerned to make sure that unless you have to absolutely visit those border communities, for residents that don't live in those border communities in New South Wales, please don't do that in the next few weeks until we're confident there hasn't been any transmission or seeding. And again, can I especially thank those border communities? It's easy to roll the words border community off the tongue, but for tens of thousands of residents, it's been an enormous inconvenience. I want to thank them for their understanding and patience. And please know that the permit system we've established, all the resources we're putting there are really to keep those communities intact. I haven't seen that happen before in any of the other border closures that have occurred around Australia. Our aim has been, irrespective of whether they're Victorians or people from New South Wales, we know they act as one community, and our purpose has been to keep those communities intact for the well-being of those communities and to reduce the stress on those communities. And that also means having to consider what that means for other residents in New South Wales. So my state is of high alert. We are definitely a different stage of the pandemic. When there's a spike anywhere else in the nation, you always have to be concerned about what it means for your residents, especially given both the proximity to Victoria and also because Victorians and New South Wales residents have so much interaction with each other. The 55 border crossings, that obviously makes us on high alert. At this point in time, there is no evidence or no advice to me to suggest that we need to change anything we're doing regarding restrictions, although we are monitoring what happens in those border communities with the seeding, but also whether we do need to consider what happens north of those border communities. At this stage, even though we are keeping that option on the table, it's not something we need to progress to at this point in time.
There has been seeding between yesterday and today. Yesterday you were warning about the border potentially moving. A lot of people are anxious and nervous, and also warning that you'd change the rules on gatherings. Now nothing. What's changed?
Well, it's, as I said yesterday, it's a daily. We are monitoring the situation daily, and I don't want anyone to feel they've been caught off guard if we do happen to need to change something in the next few days and weeks, because it's still a possibility, and I want to make that very clear. But what we find comforting is that in the last 24 hours, 18,500 people did come forward to get testing, a number of those, or increased testing in those border communities. And given the extremely low rate of community transmission, there is no science-based reason for us to change anything at this stage. But I do feel responsible in putting people on high alert. This is the situation now, but we won't know for a few weeks until all that seeding, the potential seeding, has been what we call flushed out. So we won't know for a few weeks to make sure there hasn't been any level of that community transmission kind of bubbling away under the surface, as can happen quite easily, as Melbourne has demonstrated. So that is our priority. But just to be absolutely clear, we're monitoring this on a daily basis. We get updates multiple times a day, and if at any stage we find the evidence is there to suggest there has been a level of what we call seeding or level of community transmission, we will then need to look at other options. But I just wanted to be very clear yesterday that all of us are on high alert, and every resident in New South Wales should feel on high alert. You should be extra careful. You may have had some contact with someone from Melbourne and not known about it. Please make sure that when you're out and about, working or socialising, that you maintain that social distance, whether you're eating out or whether you're doing other types of activity. This is a time when all of us have to be on high alert. You may not know the person that you're socialising with may have known someone who knows someone from Melbourne, and that's pretty much all it could take to be subjected to the virus. So all we're suggesting to everybody in the strongest possible sense is be on high alert. We are, as officials, as leaders, we are on high alert, ready to make tweaks and other decisions around restrictions if we need to, but also in particular monitoring what happens in those border communities and north of those border communities. But please know our intent is to keep those border communities intact, because that's their preference, and we also have to obviously consider the health implications of that to broader New South Wales residents.
Can you give people clarification? Shut. What's the science, what's the data telling you about when we will know roughly if this thing is
A couple of weeks. It will take at least a couple of weeks. So even though the testing to date in the last few days has been very positive for us in New South Wales, and I want to thank our health officials who not only are doing an outstanding job for all of us in New South Wales, but Dr. Chant's team is also strongly supporting Victoria. And I want to echo the words of the Prime Minister yesterday. We are all in this together, and my heart goes out to all those people living in and around Melbourne who are subjected to 6 weeks of lockdown. All of us know what that feels like. All of us know how stressful that is. And I want to support the efforts of the Victorian Government as much as we can. And I want to thank our New South Wales health officials who are helping the government down there with contact tracing. Our pathologists are actually doing thousands of tests on their behalf every day. And any support we can give them during this time will be given. But also Dr. Chant and her colleague down there are also discussing things that we might do to further support our border communities. And those discussions will continue.
Can you give people clarification, Premier? Can you give people clarification and certainty about what restrictions will come back if there has been seeding and or if people are doing the wrong thing and spreading the virus? What's first on the agenda?
Well, what's really important is for us to watch the science, and I'm not going to speculate on what that could be, apart from saying that we've been very clear on the type of activity that we know is high transmission. We know that indoor spaces allow the virus to be more contagious than outdoor spaces. We know what the high risk activities are. So all I'm saying to everybody is please be on high alert. What we're doing is taking the science, taking the evidence and the health advice on a daily basis, and if we need to move on anything, we will. At this stage, there is no evidence to suggest we need to, but we won't know for a few weeks whether there has been any seeding, or as we call community transmission, which is perhaps a better way to describe it. We won't know if there's been community transmission bubbling away under the surface that we don't know about for certain until another few weeks, which is why our state has to be on high alert. We have to be high alert in the activities that we're undertaking, to making sure we're being fussy about how we interact with others and how others interact with us, and especially border communities. Please do not go outside your border community unless you absolutely have to. And similarly, if you're a resident of New South Wales and you've got family or business activity down there, please don't go down there unless it's absolutely essential, because we won't know for a few weeks, we won't be confirmed for a few weeks that there hasn't been that level of community transmission that would cause us any concern. But because the health officials have been extremely proactive and fast in tracking down any cases and their contacts, I'm confident that the number of cases we've identified so far have been contained, but we're not confident yet that there hasn't been any seeding which might bubble up in the next couple of weeks.
So by high risk activities you mean weddings and funerals?
I'm not going to specify what action the government might take because that would only cause unnecessary concern, but I do want everybody to feel on high alert, because if we do get results, if the data starts changing and we need to act quickly, I want people to know that for the next 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks in particular, all of us have to be on high alert. And I want to be very clear about that. But at this stage, there's no evidence to suggest we need to go further, we need to change anything we're doing, apart from making sure we come forward and get tested with the mildest of symptoms, especially those border communities. And as Dr. Chant and I said yesterday, especially if you're in a community that's welcomed tourists from Melbourne or from Victoria in the last little while. So everybody in the state has to be on high alert, and especially those in and around those border communities.
Regarding the border,
I guess you wouldn't want to give ground to the Mexicans as such, but wouldn't it be in the interest of the people living in those towns to reduce the congestion on the crossings to actually make that adjustment forward?
Well, I think now that we've issued 125,000 permits, I think we'll see today less congestion because people will be allowed through more freely. But the Commissioner's on the ground today thanking all the local policemen and women who've been managing that situation for us, but also thanking the local community. And if he has any feedback to the contrary, we'll obviously take that on board. But the Commissioner himself is down there to oversee operations, and I'm deeply grateful to him and the force for doing things the way they have. And one really important learning for us and for me personally has been the involvement of all of government in dealing with this pandemic and making sure, because you can go through phases of this pandemic not knowing what might come up next, but when you have a whole of government approach, it's been fantastic, because then the health officials can focus on what they need to do, and we've got our police and other frontline emergency services personnel helping us manage all those cross-border and operational issues which keep the community safe as well.
Australians overseas were told in March to go home. It's now July. The taxpayers still paying for them to be in hotel quarantine. Is the time that they cop up?
Well, look, I think that's an extremely valid question, and I want to make very clear that the New South Wales government is seriously considering that, and obviously I'd also welcome a lowering of the daily cap around the nation as to how many people are coming on board. So I'm looking forward to that discussion tomorrow at National Cabinet. You know, it's not spoken of much, touch wood, to date in New South Wales, but to have welcomed 35,000 people back to Australia, only 2/3 of which New South Wales residents, at least a third of those, even more. On some days it's more than that, are residents of other states. I'm incredibly proud of the work we've done in that regard, but it does take up a lot of resources, it's high risk, and for that reason I would welcome the Australian government reducing the daily cap around the nation, and certainly that would mean that we could put resources elsewhere.
It's a valid question as well, because you've got police on the border and we've got
All
police
of that,
in all
exactly. During a pandemic, you have to be prepared for the unexpected, and that's why New South Wales, we've got that. Whether it's our hospital system, we now have nearly quadrupled our capacity for intensive care. Touch wood, we've not needed it, but we've quadrupled our need there. We've made sure we've acquired PPE from different parts of the world. I actually engaged with not just government but non-government private sector business leaders to help New South Wales acquire that. So we've got our stockpile of everything we might need, and we need to foresee every different consequence. But a pandemic is very unpredictable. A pandemic has very different phases. We are in a different phase now, a phase of high alert in New South Wales. But having said that, we are always trying to think ahead about what planning we can do to be able to tackle any different phase of the pandemic that arises. But we also need to be conscious of the fact that if there are any opportunities for us to reduce the stress on any of our services or any of the things we're doing, well, that's always a positive.
Just on making return travellers pay, so it's a valid question, but you can answer that question. When's it going to happen?
Well, we also have to be mindful of the fact that once you make the announcement, or if you do make an announcement, there's likely to be a rush. So you have to be careful in what the timing is and what the situation is, and whether you consider hardship arrangements. So we're considering all of those options.
Premier, the Federal Health Minister was quite disappointed about the Jetstar mishap. Has his office been in contact, and did it disappoint you that Jetstar staff failed in that health briefing?
Oh, can I be very clear about this? Mistakes are going to happen, and what we need to do is make sure that we recover quickly and move forward. A pandemic, can I tell you, seeing things from where I see on a daily basis, I'm incredibly proud of what all of our services, all of our men and women in New South Wales have done in relation to dealing with this pandemic. It is a 24-hour, 7-a-day-a-week commitment. But along the way, it doesn't matter who you are or what you are, whether you work for an airline or elsewhere, we're going to see little hiccups. You're not going to get perfection in a pandemic, far from it. But what's important is to make sure that you're confident in the processes you have, confident that the systems you have are working, and I'm certainly deeply grateful for everybody who's been working literally shoulder to the wheel for months and months, and that's off the back of a number of other things we've had to deal with in New South Wales. So I'm incredibly proud of all of our personnel, but also have to accept that ordinary individuals, people that work for non-government organisations, people are going to make mistakes. But we need to move forward, and we need to make sure that our processes across the nation are such that we're confident those processes can withstand the occasional human error which will occur. And we can't pretend it's not going to occur again anywhere around the nation. It will occur. But we need to recover quickly, have the systems in place, and that's why when Dr. Chant says that notwithstanding that every single person's been contacted, that's a relief.
The CEO of Jetstar is refusing to apologise, Premier. Do you think that plane should have been held, the passengers should have been held before allowing that health team to get there.
Yeah, can I just say that New South Wales Health were very generous, I thought, in the way they described the situation yesterday. I'll say that much. We're not the type of government that singles out organisations when they could have done things better. But I'll just say that our New South Wales health officials, and I even said to Dr. Chant, they were very generous in the way they described the situation yesterday. But our health officials have made sure that everybody's been contacted. The risk is extremely low. And when Dr. Chant doesn't worry, I certainly don't worry.
Premier, 125,000 permits still sounds like a lot of movement. Is this border really shut? How can New South Wales residents feel confident that the virus is being stopped at the border?
Well, that's why I've expressed in the strongest possible language yesterday and today how important that is. We do want to keep those border communities intact, and remember, some of those permits are one-off. It might be someone requiring medical treatment who doesn't ordinarily need to go back and forth every day. So there's three different categories of permits. There's one category which is literally for people who might send their kids on either side of the border or work on either side of the border. But the other two categories are for people who might have a one-off situation or for people who are relocating. So I've been very clear about my level of angst and concern. That's probably the thing I'm worried about most, is in acknowledging the need of those communities to stay as one, because they've got hospitals and airports on either side of the border that people rely on. That does bring with it risk, and that's why we have to keep all options on the table, whether it's we have further hardening of that border. At the moment, it's more of a checkpoint between those communities than it's a hard border closure in terms of anybody beyond those border communities. But for those border communities, it's more a checkpoint to make sure they have legitimate grounds to cross the border. But that's why we either have to consider being stricter there or else stricter north of those communities if we see evidence of any seeding or any contamination which could threaten the health and well-being of other citizens.
What should happen to the tens, hundreds or thousands of Victorians who travel to the South Coast, the holiday areas for holidays? Should they go home now?
Well, obviously, we ask everybody to follow the health orders, and I would anticipate that many people have already made arrangements to go back to their homes, and some people have two residences. So we just ask everybody to strictly follow the health orders and strictly follow what's in place already. And we're managing the situation as best we can in consideration of, you can't assume everybody's in the same circumstance. You have to be mindful of people's situations. But what we are adamant about is that people follow the health orders and make sure they are adhering to them as strictly as possible.
Would you consider postcode level lockdown for towns on the South Coast or at the border crossings where there is seeding, so suburban lockdown?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on something that hasn't happened yet. But as I said, that's why all of us need to be on high alert for the next few weeks to make sure there isn't what we call community transmission or seeding, and that's why we've put in place the extra community messaging, the extra pop-up clinics. Thank you to all those people around Merimbula and Tathra who were tested. Thank you to all those people around Albury. I've heard also that the rate of testing around the Byron community has increased as well, and this needs to continue. And can I say that I'm extremely pleased to date with the rate of extremely low community transmission for a population of our size, and given we've had 35,000 returning Aussies from overseas, what we've achieved in New South Wales is something to this point in time that I'm proud of, but that can change very quickly, and that's why all of us are on high alert. That's okay.
Can you clarify when that period of self-isolation is supposed to begin for people returning from Victoria? Is it effective as of yesterday when the public was
Yeah. Well, Dr. Chant already spoke about that, and I'd prefer for her to go through that again to make sure there's no degree of uncertainty here.
So prior to the border closure, so the program that's in place from the border closure is everyone, as a condition of entry, has to self-isolate. There are exemptions in place for those categories, critical services, so there are some exemptions, but basically anyone who's come in after the border was closed is required to self-isolate unless you've been explicitly exempt for that for certain characteristics. Prior to that, we had a public health order in place which referenced the greater area as a hotspot, and if you had travelled from the greater Melbourne area prior to the border closure, you needed to self-isolate for 14 days. And that's critical because if you've been in that area where there is community transmission, what we're concerned is that you've been inadvertently exposed. We're asking you to self-isolate, which will ensure that you limit your exposure. And so should you develop symptoms, it means that you haven't further seeded or untransmitted the disease. And as you know, we have actually opened up our businesses and our settings. So I think the other message that the Premier gave today is if we could urge people, we had observed a little bit of complacency creeping in. People, you know, those numbers when we were reporting low numbers of community transmission in New South Wales, we were seeing some complacency step in terms of the behaviours of individuals. This is not the time for complacency. This is the time, if we can get through this next 2 to 4 week period with everyone doing the right thing in terms of adhering to the guidelines, even if you've been out and about. If the people that have been exposed or in those hotspots in Melbourne when that public health order was in place self-isolate, and then obviously if people that have come in after the border closures self-isolate from anywhere in Victoria, these steps will keep us safe. But every member of the community has a responsibility over this next 2 to 4 week period. If they've got an itchy, scratchy throat, a bit of a runny nose, a cough, now is not the time to second guess whether you've got COVID symptoms. Now is the time to come forward and get testing. This will be the single most critical step in us detecting chains of transmission in the community as early as possible. And I just urge everyone in the community to come forward for testing, particularly over this 4 week period.
Dr. Chun, just quickly, with the localised lockdowns, be it suburbs, be it public housing towers in Melbourne or anywhere in the world, do you see there's some growing evidence that maybe localised lockdowns and still letting people go to the shops and that sort of thing doesn't work?
I think that what we're learning is we have to actually tailor the public health measures we put in place to a deep understanding of the way transmission is occurring in an environment and also the local context. But the key learning I've had is that the earlier you can do, the best is prevention. So preventing the outbreak in the first place, preventing the seeding of a particular environment is the best thing we can do, but also the early detection. So we know that if we can get on top of these and have cast quite a wide net. So because COVID can present as quite mild disease in many, it can actually be grumbling along and it doesn't get detected. And that's what you're seeing. If it's grumbling around in a group that perhaps are still wanting to go about their daily activities, they're not particularly unwell, but they're not recognising the seriousness of their actions. It's only until perhaps a loved one who is older that gets COVID, that may be hospitalised, that we might pick up that outbreak. That's why I'm urging everyone to come forward for testing, even with minimal symptoms, because I want to detect any seeding or introductions into the community in New South Wales at the earliest possible point, because we know that containment is so much easier at that early time.
Given the Melbourne experience, what I'm asking is if we have a similar experience in New South Wales over the next month, will you be advising the Premier against postcode lockdowns?
We will be looking at the particular circumstances. So if it's in a regional town, our approach will be very much different than if it's a postcode area. So to some extent, we have learnt that we actually have to tailor our response to the particular circumstances. What community groups are being affected? What's the transmission mode? Obviously we share our learnings with Victoria and we understand the importance of engaging with all members of the community. We need to make sure that we also have high testing rates across all age groups and all communities. And I'm really pleased at the work that our local health districts and GPs have been doing to also ensure that we've got those high rates of testing in the community.
Premier, with the lockdown in
can we just have one
Melbourne
question
taking
to you
effect
before we go, please? Labor's asking the state government to waive payroll tax for the University of Wollongong. It's suffered a $90 million shortfall due to COVID. Will the government consider pulling that lever?
Oh, look, that's a matter for the Treasurer, but everyone's doing it tough. And the government's already unleashed a range of initiatives to help businesses, like just think about the small business grants. There's $500 million that we've been giving to small business. When we've topped up that grant just recently in terms of another $3,000 available for businesses. So we're constantly looking at ways to support businesses. But that's a matter for the Treasurer.
Premier, just quickly, with the lockdown
Last
in Melbourne
question, a few
starting
questions
today, 6
ago,
weeks,
but that's okay. Yep.
New South
Yep.
Wales and Sydney welcome the AFL Grand Final.
Oh, look, absolutely, but I don't want to say anything which is going to make life even more difficult for Victorians today. We empathise completely with what they're going through. In all seriousness, we are all in this together, and all the states and territories are coming together to support the Victorian government, and just as I know they would do if the situation arose in New South Wales. And I think now complacency is our biggest enemy in New South Wales, and we just need to make sure that everybody continues to be on high alert. Thank you.
For Immigration, Alan Tudge today. But before we go to today's announcement regarding matters in Hong Kong, let me make a couple of comments about the continuing situation in Victoria. Again, I want to thank all Melburnians, all Victorians for your patience, and those who live in the border towns along the New South Wales-Victoria border. I want to thank you for your patience in managing what has, I'm sure,
leave that
been
presser there
a
for
very
a few
disruptive
moments.
last
Hey,
few
just
days.
quickly for our viewers
What we're
watching all
calling
around
for
Australia,
across,
it's time to switch
Victoria,
over to the
particularly
main
Melbourne,
channel.
but
So
along
our viewers
those border
all
town
around
areas as
Australia
well, as
over
continuing
to the
patience
main
as,
channel.
issues settle in terms of the arrangements that are in place for movement of people necessarily across those borders, dealing with freight movements, things of that nature. I've spoken to the Victorian Premier again today. Around about 25,000 on average tests are being done every day in Victoria, and particularly obviously in those key areas in Melbourne. That is an industrial scale of testing, which is an essential part of dealing with the outbreak in Victoria. And the Premier obviously made further comments today about the situation as it sits presently. But I do want to thank Victorians for how they're responding, and thank them for their continued patience. They know the drill. We all know the drill when it comes to social distancing, making sure we wash our hands and download the COVID Safe app, and all of the necessary parts of staying safe, COVID safe in the community. And I'd say more broadly across the country that we must guard against complacency. That we must continue to follow those social distancing protocols all around Australia, even in states or territories where the number of cases is effectively zero. Please don't think that any of the states or territories are immune. And if there were to be issues that presented in any of those states and territories, the best defence that we have, especially in the first instance, is that all citizens, all residents right across the country are continuing to practice the appropriate social distancing and other measures. We've seen the images in many parts of the country where I think we are seeing some of that lax, and it's important, and because we do not want to see the situation in Victoria repeated in any other part of the country. The National Cabinet will meet tomorrow and obviously go over these issues once again. And so I'd thank all of those, particularly around border towns, as the New South Wales Premier has been stressing today to stay away from those border towns if that is something you can do, and exercise that discretion, exercise that judgment. That would include for family gatherings or things of that nature. I think it'll assist everybody else who's involved in managing the border there. If that they don't have an additional pressure or additional demand on them, that will certainly help them do their job, and it'll make the circumstances for those in those border towns less stressing, although no doubt it will continue to be stressing for some days yet. So a thank you again to everyone in Victoria, and a reminder to everyone else around the country against complacency, to stay on our guard, to be patient and to be conscientious. The purpose of being here today, though, is to make a number of announcements that have been considered and agreed by the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and indeed by the Cabinet earlier this week. Firstly, let me say that our government, together with other governments around the world, have been very consistent in expressing our concerns about the imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong. And today we have agreed to announce that that national security law constitutes a fundamental change of circumstances in respect to our extradition agreement with Hong Kong. And so Australia today has taken steps to suspend our extradition agreement. We have formally notified Hong Kong and advised the Chinese authorities. I also note that our travel advice for Hong Kong has been updated and would encourage Australians to refer to that travel advice. The other issue that we are addressing is one that, as a result of changes that have occurred in Hong Kong, that there will be citizens of Hong Kong who may be looking to move elsewhere, to start a new life somewhere else, to take their skills, their businesses, and things that they've been running under the previous set of rules and arrangements in Hong Kong and seek that opportunity elsewhere. Australia has always been a very welcoming country to such people from all around the world, and our immigration system is the best in the world. It has the best controls, it has the best targeting, it has the best focus, and immigration as a result has been a pillar of the strength of our nation, not just our economy but our society as well. We are a great immigration nation. I would argue we are the best, and many countries have learned from our success in managing immigration in the national interest, and we will continue to do that. But our immigration program provides some particular opportunities for those who have been living as citizens in Hong Kong, and around 10,000 or thereabouts of Hong Kong citizens and residents are currently in Australia on student visas or on temporary work visas. What we've agreed to do is we've agreed to adjust the policy settings to ensure that for skilled and graduate visa holders, we will be extending visas by 5 years from today, with a pathway to permanent residency at the end of those 5 years. Now that means if you're a current or future student, you will be able to stay for a total of 5 years once you've graduated, with a pathway to permanent residency at the end of that period. Now, if you're a temporary graduate or skilled visa holder, your visa will be extended to provide an additional 5 years from today, in addition to the time you've already been in Australia, with a pathway to permanent residency at the end of that period. And we will also provide a 5-year visa with a pathway to permanent residency for future Hong Kong applicants for temporary skilled visas, subject to meeting an updated skills list and appropriate labour marking testing. We will also put arrangements in place to ensure we focused on Hong Kong applicants to study and work in regional areas to help address skills shortages in those areas, with express pathways to permanent residency as already applies after 3 years. We will also look at new incentives and arrangements to attract export-orientated Hong Kong-based businesses to relocate to Australia, particularly where they have a strong potential for future growth and employment of Australians. So for existing temporary work visa holders, student visa holders and graduate student visa holders, they can be here for 5 years. 5 years. And that is an extension from their existing arrangements that they would have now. Some of them would be some way into their current visa. They're already here, another 5 years. Those who are looking to the end of their study, and they would normally get 2 years, that will be extended to 5 years. And the other part is, of course, through our Global Talent Program, to be working with states and territories, and I'll be discussing this with states and territories tomorrow at the National Cabinet, at ways where if there are businesses that wish to relocate to Australia, creating jobs, bringing investment, creating opportunities for Australia, then we will be very proactive in seeking to encourage that and to see that business activity, those jobs created here in Australia. Now, I want to stress that we are not expecting large numbers of applicants in any time soon. What we have in place is the normal application mechanisms for these visas. The same rules apply to getting a student visa. The same rules apply to getting a temporary work visa. The same market testing restrictions are in place in terms of labour market testing for the awarding of temporary skilled visas. All of that remains the same. What we are doing is extending the opportunity for those visas out to 5 years in total. and looking to recruit, if you like, other businesses that may become footloose as a result of the changes that have occurred in Hong Kong. And I imagine there'll be many other countries in the region and around the world, indeed, that would be seeking to attract those businesses to Australia, and talented applicants as well, as they make their own decisions about where they wish to live in the future. Australia will be part of that group of countries, which will be both encouraging, welcoming, and taking steps to ensure we're actively engaged. And so with that, I'll hand it over to the Acting Minister for Immigration and many other things, Alan Tudge, and ask you to go through the details. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Prime Minister. As you'd be aware, Hong Kong has immense global talent and great businesses there, and we want to attract more of them to Australia, because that will generate more wealth and more jobs for Australians. Now, we already do very well in terms of attracting people from Hong Kong, but today we're outlining some further opportunities for skilled people, for entrepreneurs, for significant investors, and for businesses to come to our country. Let me go through some of the specific measures which the PM has touched on. First up, in relation to students. So the current and future students from Hong Kong will be eligible for a 5-year temporary graduate visa on the successful conclusion of their studies, and that will come with a pathway for permanent residency. So former students who are already on a graduate visa will have up to 5 years from now as well. Now, students who decide to study at a regional campus will be able to continue with the current regime where they can get permanent residency after 3 years. In relation to temporary skilled visas, current temporary skilled visa holders from Hong Kong who are in Australia at the moment will be eligible for an additional 5 years in Australia with a pathway to permanent residency at the end of that period. And that is about 600 people in Australia at the moment, not a huge number. Future Hong Kong applicants for temporary skilled visas will also be eligible for a 5-year visa, provided they meet the existing criteria. Now, that is that you must fit with one of the skills shortage criteria, and that list will be updated shortly, and it's going to be a significantly reduced list compared to what it is today. Of course, there'll need to be labour market testing as well from the sponsoring employer to prove that they are unable to find an Australian to do the job. Of course, a person can also qualify through the Global Talent Temporary Visa Scheme, which is really where we target the exceptionally talented people, particularly in the IT fields, to come here on a temporary basis if the employer particularly is willing to pay above the high income threshold. These future temporary skilled visa holders will also have a pathway to permanent residency after 5 years. Now, in relation to what I call the super talent, of which there is many in Hong Kong. We started the Global Talent Scheme visa not that long ago with the idea of providing a permanent residency visa for the absolute super global talent. And we certainly know that there is some of that talent in Hong Kong, and we will be continuing with our program there, but we'll be prioritising applicants from Hong Kong for that scheme and providing some additional resources there as well to target those particular individuals who are real job multiplying people, who create businesses, who are entrepreneurs, who have that tech talent that the world is looking for, frankly. And they will then have a permanent residency visa to enable them to come into the country. That will be the same as well for our business investment programs as well, where again we'll be prioritising some of the applicants from Hong Kong to come into Australia. Same criteria still applies for those applicants, but they'll get priority if they're applying from Hong Kong. We'll also be supporting future applications. We'll be reopening the visa application centre in Hong Kong, which was shut down during the COVID-19, at the beginning of the COVID-19 period. Finally, just in relation to attracting businesses from Hong Kong. As the PM mentioned, we'll be developing new incentives for export-oriented Hong Kong-based businesses to relocate to Australia. And with these economic incentives will also be visa pathways for all critical staff to come to Australia and have a pathway to permanent residency. Now, we know that there are over 1,000 international businesses who have their regional headquarters presently in Hong Kong. And we also know that many have already signalled that they're looking to relocate elsewhere in the world. And this includes media businesses, financial services businesses, large consulting businesses, which have already signalled that they're looking elsewhere. And we want them to look to Australia to come to and set up shop. And so we'll be developing incentives for them to do so, but with that, a package of visas as well, so that all the critical staff can come and potentially relocate in one of our cities or a region and be able to get pathways to permanent residency. So that, I think, is a great opportunity for Australia. These companies will be looking elsewhere, so we'll need to be competitive, but that's what we're going to be looking at and developing those incentives over the next period, the next few weeks. So let me repeat again, there is so much talent in Hong Kong. There are great businesses in Hong Kong, and we know that many individuals now might be looking elsewhere because they do want to be in a freer country, they want to be in a democratic country, and we want to make it attractive for that super talent to consider Australia, and that's what these measures do.
Thank you, Alan. I should also stress that the refugee and humanitarian stream remains available for those who are seeking to apply through that channel, and that is available to people all around the world. What we're announcing here today relates to the existing components of our immigration program, and this will all be accommodated very comfortably within the existing caps that we have on the overall level of visas for permanent residency into Australia, and that is particularly the case because of the significant decline in intake that has occurred because of COVID, and we don't expect that to change quickly, and so there is ample room. But I want to stress again that this is being done with continued strong labour market testing, and this is about creating jobs in Australia.
Prime Minister, in making these dual announcements, both the visa arrangements, but critically also the suspension of the extradition agreement, what statement is the Australian government making about China's adherence to one country, two systems principles? And if it is a system fundamentally defunct now, where does that leave other agreements with an autonomous Hong Kong, even the free trade agreement?
Well, our decision to suspend the extradition agreement with Hong Kong represents an acknowledgement of the fundamental change of circumstances in relation to Hong Kong because of the new security law, which in our view, and this is not just our view, this is, I'd say, a shared view of many countries, it undermines the one country, two systems framework and Hong Kong's own basic law and the high degree of autonomy guaranteed in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. That was set out there, and that is a matter of public record from Australia's point of view. What we are announcing here today, both with the extradition agreement, there's an updating to our travel advice, but in particular what we're doing here in the visa arrangements is recognising that that has taken place. And so Australia is adjusting its laws, our sovereign immigration program, things that we have responsibility for and jurisdiction over to reflect the changes that we're seeing take place there.
Do you expect this is going to put any extra pressure on international arrivals? I know yesterday you were saying there's not a good case for any redistribution of arrivals to WA, from WA to other states. Will WA see more arrivals, not less? Or are you considering, the prioritisation of those who are overseas? Maybe people who could have come back 3-4 months ago are going to have to wait a lot longer to do so in the future to start taking that pressure off states regarding those international arrivals?
Well, I'll be doing exactly what I said I was going to do yesterday. Tomorrow I'll be taking to National Cabinet a proposal that would ease the pressure on our points of entry, whether that's in Sydney or Perth or Brisbane or Adelaide in particular. Those four ports are the ones that are taking the majority, or all, I should say, of those returning Australians. New South Wales by far and away the most, And all of this will be accommodated within those restrictions. And we're not anticipating a surge of arrivals as a result of this. I mean, the decision to relocate your life, your business, where you're going to study as a new applicant is a significant decision. It's not something that I'm sure people would do overnight. The most significant impact of the decisions we've made today are for those around 10,000 people who are already in Australia. They're already here, they're studying, they're working, they're part of our community. They won't add one additional person to the population of Australia because they're already here. There's about, I think, 3,000 or thereabouts, Alan, about 3,500 who are existing visa holders in the areas I've noted, and the Minister has noted, who are currently outside of Australia, and they would be able to return to Australia under those visas under the normal arrangements, and that is within the restrictions that we've put in place.
The situation in Melbourne, how concerned are you that people are avoiding having virus tests because they can't afford not to work while they wait for the results? And what consideration is your government giving to paid pandemic leave?
Well, we've put in place JobKeeper, we've provided JobSeeker. These are the supports that the government has provided, which are at record levels. This country has never seen a level of income support provided by a federal government like they're seeing now. And we will continue to provide that. I mean, during the course, particularly of these next 6 weeks, that is entirely within the current set of arrangements for JobSeeker and for JobKeeper. And so that support will continue. And the support for placement, the Victorian government has also put some arrangements in place to support other members of the community, as other states have. And this is a shared responsibility, and the Commonwealth is certainly doing overwhelmingly its share of the heavy lifting and providing income support to people all around the country. I've answered the question.
Prime Minister, just back on Hong Kong, I know you're obviously saying you expect low numbers to begin with. Have there been any projections on how many people you are expecting based on recent visa applications, inquiries into the consulate in Hong Kong? Are we talking about hundreds rather than thousands?
I'll let the Minister respond. Shouldn't draw any, I suspect, parallels between what Australia is announcing here than with what you would have seen announced in the UK, for example. The UK has a very special relationship with Hong Kong and a very special set of responsibilities, and they're talking about numbers which are not in contemplation in Australia, or we're not seeing anything along those lines. As I say, most of the changes will impact on those who are already here in Australia, and at this stage, having just announced it, there's no indication, obviously, as of yet, about the level of interest, but I would be very confident that it will be able to be accommodated within a reasonable, whether it's hundreds or we're certainly not talking about tens of thousands or anything of that nature. We're talking at a modest level, I would have thought, and if it were to ramp up over time, then we would make whatever adjustments we had to ensure that could be accommodated and absorbed. But Alan?
I'll just add further to that. I mean, in a typical financial year, we'd have about 4,000 people from Hong Kong who would arrive, and about 3,000 of those would be students, and about 1,000 who would be in the temporary skilled or graduate visa, or temporary skilled categories. Is this going to change markedly? It's difficult to say, but obviously the limit is still going to be on the quarantining arrangements here. I mean, the students aren't coming into the country until we've got those situation opened up, where we've had the pilots and etc. But it also points out that these aren't things which will happen overnight, because you have to put in your application, that needs to be processed, you need to get your affairs in order. For a permanent residency visa, that often takes 6 to 9 months. For a temporary visa, that's sometimes shortened. But I think you're talking in the hundreds or low thousands, rather than the figures which the PM mentioned.
Australia basically made a judgment that it no longer believes the citizens of its largest trading partner are safe. Are you prepared for further trade strikes and retaliation from Beijing in response to this?
Well, I don't agree with your assessment of the nature of the travel advices that we've been provided. I'll let the travel advice speak for itself, rather it being editorialised on. Those are matters entirely for the Chinese Communist Party government. They're not matters for Australia. We will make decisions about what's in our interests, and we will make decisions about our laws and our advisories, and we will do that rationally and soberly and consistently, and that's exactly what we've done, and we will continue to do that on that basis.
In regards to Victoria, there are growing claims that the Victorian government chose to use security guards to guard hotels in order to cosy up to unions. Can I ask you what your thoughts are in regards to that? And also the idea that some of the democratic principles in Victoria seem to be under threat, with the Labor Party taking control of the state wing down there and not necessarily telling voters which minister is responsible for what's happened. Does that concern you?
Well, as my practice in relation to what's been happening in Victoria is the same that I've applied in other states when they've had troubles. I haven't seen myself as a commentator on those state governments. I've seen myself simply seeking to help them deal with the problems that they've had. And there have been challenges in other states before Victoria, admittedly not as significant as this. But I never found it terribly helpful to get into a commentary on those state governments. It was much better, I think, for me and my government just to provide them every support we can. Now, I can understand that many, many people in Victoria will be feeling very frustrated at the moment, and many are very angry, and I am aware of where they're directing that frustration and anger. But it won't help the situation if I were to engage in any of that. I have a good working relationship with the Victorian government, and it's our job just to work together to solve this and to get on top of it, and we'll continue to apply our resources to that end. Now, as is a matter of public record, the Commonwealth has made available the offer consistently about ADF support in Victoria to assist with any of the tasks, which included quarantine if that was what they wished. But ultimately, governments have got to make decisions about how they want to use those resources and deploy those resources, and of course they're accountable for the decisions that they make, and who they contract to do the job is a matter for them, and they've got to explain those decisions in their jurisdiction like I have to explain the decisions I make in ours. Sorry, one at a time.
Prime Minister, that the announcement mostly focuses on people already here in Australia. But for those future applicants, do you expect any countermeasures from China that might make it difficult for those people to come to Australia to take up that offer, in effect preventing or making it harder for people to leave Hong Kong to take up this offer?
Well, I don't, but if that were to occur, that would be very disappointing.
Home lending figures came out today.
Sorry, I missed that.
Home lending figures came out today.
Right.
Huge plunge, double-digit plunge. This is a time with record low interest rates as well. We've also seen a couple of months of sliding house prices. Do you have any concerns about the housing market, and what can the government do to avoid a house price collapse?
Well, the thing about the Australian housing market is that demand has always outstripped supply, particularly in those markets which have been most heated. And we're talking largely about the eastern seaboard markets there. I mean, the situation in Perth and Adelaide has been a bit different, but even down in Hobart, more recently, we've seen an undersupply of housing and oversupply demand. And that has always been what's driven the housing market. It hasn't been driven by speculative investor bubbles or speculative credit, things like that, which we've seen occur in other countries. And I think one of the problems about the commentary on the housing market is too often the analysis has appropriated the conditions of other places and applied them to Australia, and that application has been completely misguided. Of course you're going to see a resistance, a concern amongst consumers during the time we're experiencing right now. It would be surprising if we did not see that. But I think fundamentally the structural position of the housing markets in Australia would tell a far more stronger tale in terms of their resilience. That's why I welcome particularly yesterday the decisions by the banks to be able to continue to roll over and defer payments in relation to debts. That's important. That's one of the many changes that have been important to date and will be important later in the year. And we're working through very similar issues. So I think it would be presumptive or a little premature is probably the better word, to be making medium or even short-term forecasts about the Australian property market at the moment. I think we'll see issues work their way through, and this is why it's important that we continue to deal with these crises as a dual, two, that is, economic and health. Getting on top of the health supports the economic performance and vice versa. And that's why around the rest of the country, which isn't in isolation, it's important that we continue to open up our economies between states and the trade and commerce that takes place between states and territories, because that's how the jobs come back. Jobs come back, then the strength of markets, particularly housing markets, is supported by that. I'm encouraged that in the housing markets in particular, that those who have taken advantage of the opportunity to draw down on their super balances, I'm advised by the banks that many have actually put it into their mortgages to improve their resilience in the mortgage, with their mortgage and in the housing market, and that strikes me as a fairly common sense thing to do.
Prime Minister, Greg Hunter said that 7 out of the 8 states and territories have done hotel quarantine well. So why is there the need to ease that pressure on the system? How low do you think the cap on arrival should go, and how will it be allocated?
Well, I'll be discussing those matters with the National Cabinet tomorrow.
Prime Minister, have you had discussions with the ACT about getting Victorian MPs and staffers and ministers into the ACT? Are we going to see ministers moving here to get around the border closures?
Well, it's still early days today, but I'm pleased that the ACT government enabled my colleague to join me here today under quite strict conditions. And I appreciate Andrew Buzz and the Chief Health Officer here in the ACT's practical management of those issues, but there are still many more to manage. Parliament doesn't return till August, and so there's a bit to sort out between now and then. So we'll deal with those issues carefully, and there is an engagement between the Parliament and the ACT government about how those issues will be managed for the return of Parliament, and indeed for ministers. Some ministers were already here when the decision was taken in relation to Victoria, but their families are in Victoria, so there will need to be, I think, some practical arrangements put in place. And I can tell you they'll all be very well behaved and they'll follow all the rules as you'd expect them to, just as Minister Tudge has today. Thank you all very much.
Addressing the nation with the very latest on the unfolding coronavirus situation. And of course, Victoria at the peak, Melbourne currently in lockdown. We've got 1 new case in the Australian Capital Territory, as well as 2 healthcare workers working from the Royal Melbourne Hospital. They have tested positive. We've also had more cases across Victoria, and we are standing by to take you across to Victoria in Melbourne shortly, where we expect Daniel Andrews to give a press conference. And of course, our viewers watching here on YouTube, you will not have to switch channels, but that will be all good. New South Wales has 13 new COVID-19 cases. Of course, we heard from the Premier of New South Wales earlier on, concerned for the welfare of residents in New South Wales. Victoria has recorded 165 new COVID cases. Not sure if that's been overnight, but that is a big jump, of course. Metropolitan Melbourne currently in lockdown, and 30 of those cases have been linked to current and known outbreaks. Now, we've got Thursday night football coming up. The Rugby, Cowboys and Roosters. That one will be live and free here on the Speaker Network. And we've also got the AFL as well, Cats and Lions. A big game as well, Thursday night football on the Speaker Network. So, what are we doing? We are standing by to take you to Melbourne, where we expect the Premier Dan Andrews, for those just joining us, to give a press conference. No doubt he will have lots to talk about. Plenty of happenings across Melbourne and Victoria with a jump of cases. I think it was 160 something cases. I'll get that up for you in just a moment. And that one will be over on the main channel for our viewers watching all around Australia. Although for those watching on YouTube, you will not have to switch. Now, going back to Victoria, they've recorded 165 new coronavirus cases. 30 of those have been linked to known outbreaks. So just stay with us, because Dan Andrews is expected very shortly here on the Speaker Network. We will bring it to you live. So we're not exactly sure what time Dan will start the conference, but I assume that he will obviously go over the rise in cases overnight. He'll talk about how the restrictions, the stage 3 restrictions for metropolitan Melbourne are going so far. Of course, we're one day in. There's still another 6 weeks or so to go. So it'll be very interesting to see what he has to say. We're not exactly sure if there'll be any more restrictions or anything like that coming into effect, but no doubt Dan will deliver it, and he'll deliver it very soon here on the Speaker Network. Speaking of the Speaker Network, Thursday Night Football is coming up. We've got 2 blockbuster games. We've got the Cowboys and Roosters, the NRL, that is sure to be a blockbuster. And we've also got Geelong and Brisbane, my team, up against the Lions. And that one will be live and free. Both of those will be live and free here on the Speaker Network. Okay, with that being said, we're taking a short break. Dan Andrews not too far away. Stay with us.
It's magic, isn't it? How the world makes itself new every minute, every day. One moment you're doing your thing, the next this thing's beaming it live to 700 of your best friends. Now you're talking to your granny as a hologram.
Hi, hologram.
But for all this magic, you're not just going to need a bigger network. You're going to need a whole new kind of network. One that's ready for all that's ahead of us. A network fast enough to handle your new phone. No, not that one. The one you're going to get next year. A network that travels with you, far from home. A network that can make a store talk to a cow, the cow to a farmer, a truck to your fridge to your car. Hang on, there's nobody driving that car. Oh, that's right. The network is. It's a magical time to be alive on a new kind of network that'll help you thrive. In the next few years, we'll be streaming twice as many videos, with 5 times the traffic, in a world with billions more connected devices. That's why we're building a new kind of network, so you can thrive. With Telstra, you can experience the speeds of Australia's fastest mobile network, so you can watch your favourite show without missing a... Oh, spoiler alert. Thrive on a new kind of network.
Hey, it's Jody.
Telstra 4G delivers more speed in more places, so you can connect to what matters most. Thrive on a new kind of network. With over 19 million Wi-Fi hotspots around the world, and more than 900,000 Telstra Air hotspots across Australia, you can feel at home when you're far from home. Thrive on a new kind of network.
Okay, we're returning to general programming here on the Speaker Network. We will break back into programming as soon as Dan Andrews is ready to go for the press conference. So back to regular programming, and we'll see you shortly for Dan Andrews and his press conference. Before we break away, Thursday Night Football, Cowboys and Roosters. We've also got the Cats and the Lions. Thursday Night Football, sure to be some blockbuster games. Okay, I think my director wants me to through to general programming. So after general programming, we will break into programming again shortly.